Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 5. The Kingdom of Splintered Stones. The air in the great halls Nar-Uzdum-Arak grew thick and heavy, like molten lead, as if before a silent, yet inevitable mountain slide ready to bury not only bodies, but memory itself, the ancient, rune-scored vaults, which remembered the oaths of the first kings, the drone of thousand-ton hammers, and the solemn hymns of great feast days, found no echo in fraternal voices or the ring of forge hammers for the first time in centuries. Only a dull, ominous, suffocating silence answered from every shadow of the side galleries and abandoned shafts. The stony visages of ancestors, carved with incredible, near-magical skill, gazed from the walls not with paternal wisdom, but with a mute, eternal reproach, silently watching as stone by stone, bond by bond, all they had built, nurtured, and guarded for long ages crumbled away. The schism had passed through the very heart of the fortress, like a deep crack in the strongest granite, beginning as a hairline and splitting the monolith in two. By the northern gates, massive and sealed tight, where the great tunnel, the artery of bygone night, vanished into impenetrable, damp darkness towards the lost, Morn Khazad-Gatol, the followers of Dumran gathered. Their fires, smoldering with low, acrid coal smoke, cast restless, dancing shadows on the ancient time and soot-blackened masonry, shadows that seemed like phantoms of a vanished unity. Dwarves in dusty, scratched steel breastplates, their faces soot-stained more from heavy thoughts than from any forge, whispered by pyramids of stacked weapons, their movements spare and wary. Their beards, once a point of pride, meticulously braided and adorned with metal rings, now hung disheveled, unkempt, matted, as if external neglect mirrored an inner desolation. In their weary, deep-set eyes, usually hard as the stone itself, one could read not mere disappointment or anger, but something more bitter and dark, seated deeper, rooted in the very soul of the people. Shame and bitterness at being unable to protect their ancestors' legacy by any means, other than splitting it asunder. At the opposite end of the fortress, where the stone vaults lightened a little, by the low but sturdy southern gates leading to sun, wind, and the trade routes of the outer world, a different, yet equally oppressive atmosphere reigned. Here, the camp of the Copperbeards resembled a large, disturbed and loudly buzzing hive, ready to spill its swarm. The air hummed with arguments, sharp shouts, and the clang not of weapons, but of tools. Their fires burned brighter, but the light was just as uneven and anxious, snatching from the half-dark faces twisted not by quiet sorrow, but by heated, spiteful dispute. Between the two camps, in the vast central hall, yawned an emptiness not just 100 paces of distance, but a whole chasm, suddenly gaping between those who just yesterday had shared bread and shelter, joy and grief, when a dwarf from the Iron Hand clan accidentally met the gaze of a Copperbeard warrior. Across this space, a heavy tension hung in the stifling air, sharp as a honed blade, fingers involuntarily tightened on familiar weapon hilts, jaws clenched to cracking. The silence between them grew louder than any words, even the angriest, and in that very silence, like mold in a damp corner, something dangerous and inexorable festered. This was not just a quarrel, not just a falling out, it was the slow, sure dying of all they had once built together. Every glance full of mute accusation, every shoulder turned away, these were small, invisible blows against the already cracked slab of common brotherhood, and each such blow left upon it ever deeper and more indelible marks. The air in the western, smithing chambers grew thick with acrid smoke, heavy with the heat of forges that blazed tirelessly day and night. The pungent, metallic smell of red-hot iron and coal seeped into the porous stone walls, into sweat-soaked clothes, into the very gray beards of the dwarves. Every hammer blow on the anvil echoed in the high vaults with a dull, stubborn sound, and this was not just the nose of labor, but a challenge thrown to fate itself. The smiths, whose ancestors for centuries had forged armor for all of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, now worked only for their own. The flames of their forges illuminated not a common cause, the private need. They mended only their own breastplates, sharpened only their own blades. The sparks that flew up to the black ceiling were like the last, futile attempts to hold warmth in the cooling heart of the fortress. Their hands moved with accustomed strength, but their eyes held no forward fire, only a weary, dull resolve to do what must be done, because there was no other way, because tomorrow might bring a battle not with an external foe, but with one who just yesterday had stood beside them at this very anvil. To the east of the fortress, in the artisans' quarters, a different, opposing mood breathed. Here the air was lighter, smelling of wax, wood, and stone polished to a mirror gleam. Instead of battle axes, they sharpened fine engraving chisels instead of plate armor. They fashioned delicate ornaments. The quiet, almost musical chime of small hammers echoed the unspoken, yet understood by all. We choose life, not death. Here the silence was of another kind, not heavy and wrathful, as by the northern gates, but light and bitter, like resignation to the inevitable and the necessity of living on. Even in the deepest, eternal mines where mithril and adamant were hewn, the same oppressive weariness linger. Dwarves from different, now hostile clans descended into the earth at different times, carefully avoiding chance encounters in the dark depths. The most precious ores were dumped into separate, marked carts, and each such batch underwent a double, humiliating check. Trust had drained from here like water into dry sand. Before, in these mines, in pitch darkness broken only by the dim light of lanterns, a dwarf relied on his comrade, on his keen eye and strong hand. Now every step deeper into the mountain was fraught with apprehension. A rustle in a side shaft might be not just a falling stone, but an alien presence. The sound of a pickaxe in the distance made one start and reach for a weapon. They were hewing the stone that had for centuries been the foundation of their strength and wealth. But now the very process of extraction began to feel like stealing from themselves. Carts with precious ore rolled to different ends of the fortress, as if the blood of one body flowed through severed vessels, no longer nourishing a single heart. Once at dawn by the main well in the central hall, a brief but eloquent silent confrontation occurred. A young, sturdy smith from the Iron Hands and a lean jeweler from the Copperbeards reached for water in the same instant. Their hands froze in the air, fingers clutching emptiness. From under the arched vaults, from the shadows, dozens of eyes of their kin watched them intently, breath held. Finally, the jeweler, lips pressed tight, stepped back a pace, yielding the way. But there was not a drop of the old respect in this gesture, only a cold, calculating caution that held far more hidden threat than any open enmity. This was not a concession, but a tactical retreat, not a recognition of seniority, but a weighing of risk. And this tiny episode, this moment of silent confrontation by the well of life-giving water, became a mirror of the entire great tragedy playing out under the stone vaults of Nar-Uzdum-Arak. In his private chambers, by the wall, Dumran Iron Hand stood motionless, like one of the ancestor-carved statues that kept their silence in the depths of tombs. Weariness, heavy and relentless as a seam of granite, weighed on his shoulders. But he did not allow himself to bend. Before him, covering half the wall, stretched a huge stone map of the underground ways, not a drawing on parchment, but a living history, carved by the chisels of the clan's best cartographers. Every line, every bend of a tunnel was cut with such precision that it seemed one had only to run a finger along the groove to feel the rough surface of real rock, to catch the scent of damp and metal. In his powerful hand, covered with old burns and scars, lay a faceted magnifying crystal, cold and clear as mountain ice. Blue, cold highlights, born of a single candle's flame, slid along the delicate roots carved in stone, bringing them to life with a ghostly, shimmering light. They ran along the great tunnel to the lost chasm, turned towards abandoned mithril scenes, wound through labyrinths known only to the guardians of the deepest shafts. He saw not just lines. He saw how the great fortress, a single organism once compacted into a monolithic, unbreakable mass, was slowly, surely dying, divided into by an invisible, yet sharp knife of discord. This knife was not made of steel, it was forged from grievances, fears, and differing understandings of the same grief. The map showed a whole, but his mind shattered it into two parts. Ours and theirs. To retreat now meant not just ceding ground. It meant betraying the memory of all the fathers and grandfathers who had fallen at the walls of Khazad-Gatol, those whose cries must still be frozen as echoes in the stone pores of those halls. Their bones, he knew this with the same certainty with which he knew the weight of his own hammer, still whitened in those cursed, darkness-choked chambers, unburied, calling for vengeance or, perhaps, for peace. The thought of retreat stirred in his breast not anger, but a dull, nauseating heaviness, as if he were trying to shift an entire mountain range. His fingers, calloused and strong, clenched the crystal so that it might have shattered with a quiet, pure sound, like the deaf crack of something brittle. But the crystal was as hard as his resolve. At the other end of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, in his workshop, Torben Copperbeard sat hunched over a roughly hewn table, by the light of torches, whose flames cast huge, dancing shadows on walls crowded with unfinished trinkets and precise instruments. He studied an urgent report from the miners. The paper was dirty, crumpled, with spots blurred by sweat or perhaps by subterranean damp. The news, scrawled in a careless, hurried hand, was bad and inescapable, like the sudden silence before a cave-in. In the eastern depths, at the very edge of their holdings, an old shaft had collapsed. The very one lawn in need of reinforcement. 3 miners had not returned from the night stake. They would not be found. They were gone. This was not a heroic death in battle, but a dull, senseless sacrifice to neglect and oblivion. Torben set the leaf aside, and his hand, accustomed to jeweler's precision, trembled. He glanced at the wooden supports hastily erected in the neighboring gallery, pitiful, temporary crutches against the weight of an entire world, without regular shipments of quality iron from the west, from the forges of the Iron Hand clan. All repair work had to be done with this rubbish. Wood bent, cracked, soaked up dampness and slowly rotting. And he knew the next news could be even more bitter news. That something greater than a shaft had collapsed. Unlike the dwarves remaining in Nar-Uzdum-Arak, the clan of Deep Wardens had departed into a complete, proud, soul-chilling silence. Their leaving was not like the fussy preparations of other departed clans. It was a slow, inexorable dissolution into the stone, akin to water seeping into parched earth. Their mithril breastplates, which usually gleamed even in deep darkness with a blue, cold light, now swallowed torch flame, giving back no reflection. Their adamant shields, each thrice the weight of a normal one, did not clang against stalactites, but slid past them in absolute silence, as if they weren't there at all. Only the mithril weapons, honed to razor sharpness, and the stores of dried meat and barley cakes and wide shoulder sacks of thick, tarred canvas spoke of a long journey. They left not in protest, not from fear, but driven by a cold, crystalline clarity of duty, to protect what they believed, in the darkest corners of their stone hearts, was more important than any quarrel, any grievance, even the memory of ancestral glory itself. These silent, unyielding warriors, whose beards, braided tight, were gray from eternal subterranean dust, not age, had stood their watch from generation to generation. Their fathers and grandfathers for centuries had stood in pitch darkness, by the narrow passages to the mithril and adamant seems the very lifeblood and unshakable foundation of all dwarven might, wealth, and honor. Their faces, like weathered crags, expressed nothing but focus, and deep in their eyes, accustomed to discerning the slightest movement in eternal gloom, burned a steady and dying flame of resolve. They had openly, without loud speeches or oaths at assemblies, declared their position, duty to the living, whose breath warmed the air in the forges, and to future generations, whose hands had not yet touched a hammer's haft, was immeasurably and irrevocably more important than duty to the cooled ashes of ancestors, whose bones had already become part of the mountain's mass. While other clans, like disturbed swarms, argued fiercely about the past, ticking over old grievances and feuds, the Deep Wardens remembered the present. They remembered the visible, tangible threats, whose stirring was already felt on the skin at the borders of their world. Not the phantoms of bygone glory, but a real, alien darkness, encroaching upon the very walls, threatening the very future of stone and steel. Their elder, Bridstone heart, whose face, like a wine-scoured cliff, bore the imprint of millennia, not yours, felt it. This was not fear or premonition, it was knowledge, seeping into his bones, into the very depths of his stone heart. His fingers, resting on the haft of a war axe whose notches mirrored the curves of his own wrinkles, felt a faint, nagging vibration, emanating not from the weapon, but from the floor itself, from the stone mass beneath his feet. This was not the mountain's song, which he had known since childhood, its low, visceral hum that soothed and lulled. This was a different sound, like the rhythm of a sick heart. Something enormous, ancient, something whose sleep was older than dwarven memory itself, older than their first songs of stone and fire. It slumbered in the darkest womb of the world, in layers where not even the ring of a pickaxe reached, in depths that were not mere emptiness, but another, alien existence. And now this something was awakening, not hastily, not wrathfully, but with that inexorable, monstrous slowness with which a colossus stirs in its sleep. Its awakening was not a crash, it was a quiet call, a hum. And for Brid, whose being was fused with stone, these signs were clearer than the fiery runes on adamant gates. The threat approached not from without, but from within, from the depths of the mountain itself. And it demanded not counsel, not debate. It demanded him, his clan, and their silent, razor-honed axes. It demanded an answer, to be given not in words, but in steel and silence. And when the Deep Wardens left, their absence within the fortress walls was felt in the cold air of forges left without mithril, in the wary silence on the frontiers, where the familiar clatter of adamant shields was no longer heard. This was an emptiness not from a lack of people, but from a lack of support, from the absence of that very unyielding rock against which all waves of darkness broke. And in this emptiness, genuine, icy fear took root for the first time. In the eastern halls, where not long ago the air hummed with the counterpoint of little hammers and gems were sifted, a dead, sepulchral silence now reigned. A silence thicker and more terrible than any knows. It hung in the chambers, motionless and heavy as a funeral shroud, broken only by the echo of their own footsteps, which returned distorted, like a mocking whisper from the void. The Copperbeards, bereft of the invisible yet unshakable shield of the Deep Wardens, felt their nakedness. They, masters of fine work and trade deals, did not fear open battle, but this silence, this absence was a different kind of threat. They feared to stray far from the main, well-lit and guarded halls, as if torchlight were the last island of safety in an advancing sea of impenetrable gloom. Their gazes, usually confident and calculating, now darted to every dark opening, every yawning arch of an abandoned gallery. The mining of silver and gems, the very thing that fed and clothed the clan, the music of their lives, had all but ceased. The mines, teeming with activity just yesterday, stood empty and cold. Even the most desperate and greedy miners, those who would risk a sleeping worm's maw for a vein of pure mithril, now dared not descend to the lower, unexplored levels. Down there, it was not simply dark, the unknown reigned, and this unknown made itself known. At night, when tense drowsiness fell over the main halls, sounds came from the impenetrable dark of the long-sealed side tunnels. Not loud sounds, but all the more soul-chilling for it. A long, grinding scrape of stone on stone, as if something huge and heavy were slowly turning over in tight confines. Quiet, rustling whispers, like the movement of many dry, scaly bodies. These sounds made the sentinels standing by timidly blazing braziers strain to peer into the black, utterly impermeable emptiness of the passageway, gripping the hafts of their halberds in suddenly numb, sweaty palms until their knuckles whitened. They knew something was there, and that something was watching and waiting. Torben Copperbeard found no peace day or night. His quarters now felt like a stone trap. He sat at a table roughly hewn from stone but saw it not. His gaze was fixed on the time, and damp cracked leather maps of the mine spread before him. His worn, scarred fingers, marked by fine chisel cuts, traced the winding lines of tunnels as if trying to feel a pulse, to find a weak spot, a loophole. His finger trembled, stopping at a point marking the richest mithril seam and the routes to it through the lower levels which now belonged to the silence and the whispers. Torben's lips, hidden in a once grim gray beard, twitched, giving voice to a silent, bitter reproach to himself, to the world, to the departed wardens. "We are mortally short of wardens," he whispered into the room's silence, and his voice, usually firm and commanding, sounded weary, cracked, and hopeless. This was not a statement of fact, but an admission of defeat, an admission that their skill, their wealth, were useless before the face of that darkness which others had always held back, those whom in their arrogance they had considered mere brutes. At the other end of the sundered fortress, in his quarters smelling of smoke, leather, and steel, Dummer Ironhand studied different reports by the dim, sooty light of torches. They came from the north, from under the cursed walls of Khazad-Gatol, and bore the stamp of desperation and blood. Messengers, who made their way through cave-ins and countless goblin ambushes over long, tortuous days, resembled phantoms more than dwarves. Wounded, exhausted, with eyes in which only the dull fire of duty fulfilled still burned. They brought not tidings, they brought bitter truth, carved on tablets of new losses. Without the light, sturdy, almost weightless mithril armor their clan had forged for the entire fortress for centuries, even the most hardened and valiant of Dumrin's warriors became targets. They fell like flies on sticky tape under the blunt, treacherous blows of goblin scimitars, unable to pierce goblin mail with their own weighted, outdated steel. And the wounded were abandoned in the pitch darkness of narrow tunnels, dying alone and in agony, never awaiting aid, their last rattles dissolving into the stone deafness, becoming part of the silence that advanced from both north and east. Dumrin clenched the parchment until his knuckles whitened. He saw not lines, he saw faces, faces of those who would never return. And into his heart, already burdened with grievance and unshakable resolve, settled a new, Cold and rational fury. Fury at the understanding that his enemies were now not only before him, in the Copperbeards, but also those who had gone east and abandoned him, the Deep Wardens. And at this time, in the very depths of the endless subterranean labyrinths, many miles from the strife-torn fortress, the Deep Wardens relentlessly continued their path. Days merged into weeks in the eternal, impenetrable gloom of nameless tunnels, where the air thickened like spoiled, aged wine, smelling of ancient, untouched dust from forgotten epochs. The vaults here were covered with strange, unknown runes whose meaning had long been lost, and in the oppressive, absolute silence stood an indistinct, low hum like the echo of a great subterranean city buried under countless eons. Brid Stoneheart walked unhurried at the head of his taciturn band, his black, matte armor frosting over with hoarfrost from the eternal cold. In these deep, forgotten minds reigned an icy, bone-piercing chill, knowing no change of seasons. He recalled fragmentary reports from his scouts. The stone whispers differently, not as before. The air tastes of alien metal. Shadows stir where there is no light. Now he saw and felt it all with his own eyes and skin. The tunnel walls in places shone with an unnatural, mirror smoothness, as if something enormous, liquid, and inexorable had flowed over them for centuries, polishing the stone. At times from the black darkness ahead came a dull, swelling roar, like distant thunder. After Brid, his wardens froze in place, their fingers reflexively tightening on battle-axe hafts. But long, drawn-out hours passed, and nothing changed. Only a hollow echo rolled through the empty, dead halls. They found strange tracks, not goblin or kobold, but something utterly different, unfamiliar. Melted, glass-like stone frozen in bizarre, unnatural shapes, and large crystals growing on the walls in defiance of all known laws of nature. They had long passed the last known mines, those meticulously marked on all maps for ages, be they the monumental slab stored in Dumran's Hall, or the elegant parchments in Torben's study. Here ended the world known to dwarves. Here ended history, captured in ink and chisel. Now they delved into tunnels, but existed on no chart. These passages were not hewn, they seemed to have grown through the rock mass, their walls wild, uneven, as if squeezed from within by a giant, blind effort. The air here was different. It was thick as jelly, stifling and heavy for lungs accustomed to the thin coolness of high vaults. It smelled not just of damp stone and the mold of oblivion. Something else hung in it, barely perceptible, but all the more disquieting. The scent of ancient, untouched stone, that which had never known the touch of a pickaxe. The scent of a void that had never been inhabited, and beneath it a sweetish, putrid whiff of something old, forgotten, something that had lived, died, and rotted in eternal darkness long before dwarves appeared. Brid led the band by memory, not by maps. Those were but useless scraps of parchment here, a mockery of the unknown. He led them by what was stored not in chests, but in blood, by a heritage passed from generation to generation, from father to son, in the quiet by the forge or in long nights underground, when words flowed softly like subterranean streams. This was knowledge carved not on stone, but in the very soul of the Deep Warden bloodline. In his mind, old and wise as these mountains themselves, lived not clear maps, but vague images, fragments of sagas, carried through the ages in a distorted, yet no less truthful whisper. He remembered stories told by his father, and to him by his, stretching back into the misty deeps of time, stories of the first dwarves, bold and daring, who had only just begun to dig these tunnels, their pickaxes still ringing on virgin rock, not yet reaching the deepest, richest seams. He remembered other, darker tales of those who lived in the mountains before them. Not dwarves, not goblins, but something else, whose names were erased from memory, dissolved like salt in water, but whose presence, cold and indifferent, was still felt somewhere in the depths, like a slight chill on the back in an utterly dark room. And, of course, he remembered the renounced clans, of legendary, almost mythical brethren who had long ago gone east, of those who guarded not mines, but the gates of light, the fortress of Sarngatol, standing not in the bowels, but on the easternmost frontiers, at the mountain peak's exit, where the first ray of sun touches the eternal snow-capped summits and where the air is pure, cold, and bright. They had left to guard not stone, but the border between worlds. Their fate was shrouded in mystery, and their duty was considered even more exalted than that of the wardens. And now Brid was leading his dwarves in the same direction, but not towards the light, but into the very thick of the awakening darkness, which perhaps had once forced those others to renounce the underworld. His memory was not a map, but a compass, whose needle pointed not north, but into the depths of centuries and into the depths of the mountains, where legends ended and unknown reality began. On one of the endless subterranean nights, when only the light of their lanterns fought the absolute dark, Brid sharply raised a hand in its iron gauntlet, halting the entire band. "Listen," he whispered, and his whisper was like the rustle of settling sand. And they, holding their breath, tried to hear what their commander heard, that the quiet, barely perceptible, yet continuous hum, emanating from everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the very air. Unlike the sound of a cave-in or shifting rock, more like the slow, deep, measured breathing of a sleeping colossus of a mountain, was audible only to him. They descended ever deeper into the world's belly, and with each new step the familiar, inhabited world remained somewhere far above, beyond many miles of stone mass. The air grew heavier, thicker, smelling of clammy damp and age-old, untouched dust that smelled of time itself. The tunnel vaults, once even and worked, now resembled wild, natural caverns, and under the dwarves' feet crunched sharp stone fragments that had never known the touch of chisel or pickaxe. First, new rustlings appeared in the opening tunnels, barely audible, almost ghostly, a light, rustling whisper somewhere behind, a quiet, dry crack as if stone compress and groan under the relentless pressure of the entire mountain mass. The dwarves grew alert, froze, peering into the impenetrable dark beyond the ring of their torchlight, but saw nothing but emptiness. Only the tongues of flame cast restless, dancing shadows on the uneven, rough walls, and in the silence it began to seem that these very shadows lived their own, unhurried and alien life, that the farther, the more stubbornly they pressed inward, the clearer, the more insistent these sounds became. Rustlings multiply, as if something invisible, many-limbed and numerous, moved parallel to their path, hidden by only a thin partition of rock. Sometimes, in the tomb-like silence came a sharp, dry crack like a whip's lash, as if somewhere deep in the stone flesh of the mountain a huge, colossal vertebra snapped and shifted. The dwarves flinched, their fingers involuntarily tightening on well-worn axe and pick hafts. From childhood they were accustomed to the dull rumble of cave-ins and the screech of shifting stone, but this was something else, quiet, insistent, almost alive and aware. Brid walked unwaveringly ahead of all, his frost-rimed armor casting dull, liquid highlights in the torchlight. He did not look over his shoulder, showed no signs of alarm, but his ears, old and sensitive to the slightest changes in the familiar symphony of the underworld, caught and analyzed every new, alien sound. He heard how somewhere to the right, in a side gallery, fine gravel trickled down, as if invisible. Agile feet scurried across a stone floor. He heard a short, abrupt scrape to the left, like the sound of a sharp claw slowly and purposefully dragging across granite. They saw no one in the pitch dark, but felt with their skin, their bones, something was here, very close, breathing the same air, something ancient, having outlived the dawn and dusk of their own civilization, all their great wars and petty feuds, something for whom these endless tunnels were not a conquest, but an original, only home. And this something now watched them from the gloom, unhurried, expectant, accompanying their every step with quiet, inexplicable rustlings and disquieting cracks in the impenetrable darkness. They descended ever deeper, and with each step the air became heavier, thicker, saturated with a damp, icy cold and the musty smell of ancient, untouched stone. The tunnel vaults narrow, as if constricting in anticipation of something. The walls pressed closer, and torches cast quivering, distorted shadows that seemed like living beings and moved willfully, contrary to the flames' movement. Fine gravel crunched underfoot, and the echo of their heavy, measured steps carried far ahead along the stone corridors, like a persistent herald warning of their approach to all that lurked ahead. Suddenly Brid froze, sharply raising his iron gauntleted hand. His fingers clenched into a tight fist, and he slowly turned, his eyes, accustomed to eternal half-dark, narrowed to slits, seeking an unseen threat. "We are being watched," he uttered quietly, almost a whisper, but his voice, low and hoarse from years of inhaling stone dust, sounded with such iron certainty that the other warriors felt an inner chill, and the blood drained from their faces. "We are being tracked, now." He did not shout, did not raise an alarm, but each word was filled with the heavy, leaden weight of realizing imminent danger. His searching gaze slid over the surrounding darkness from all sides, seeking the slightest movement, that sign which eluded his kin's eyes. He felt it with the skin of his back, not just random sounds, not just harmless rustlings, but an unseen, hostile presence, alien and relentlessly attentive. Something watched them from the very depths of these tunnels, something that knew these winding paths better than they themselves and merely bided its time. Its moment. Finally, the dwarves emerged into a vast, yawning emptiness of an underground cavity, whose high, crack-ridden vaults were lost in impenetrable, black heights where the light of their torches did not reach. The air here was utterly still, dead and damp, smelling of old dampness and something ancient, forgotten, not belonging to this world. In the weak, trembling light of their torches, thousands of stalactites, hanging from the ceiling like giant stone icicles preserving the silence of entire epochs, gleamed like the teeth of a giant. And then they finally saw them, these mysterious denizens of the deeps. First, they were merely pale, blurry spots in the pitch dark, gliding between massive stone columns like phantoms. Then, as the dwarves' eyes adjusted to the half-light, eerie details began to emerge. Semi-transparent, almost phosphorescent skin, huge, perfectly round eyes reflecting the meager torchlight like a cat's at night long, incredibly prehensile fingers with suckers, soundlessly clinging to the slightest irregularities in the rock. The creatures moved absolutely noiselessly, blending with the texture of the stone walls, their pale, pigmentless bodies almost indistinguishable in color from the surrounding limestone. Brid Stoneheart slowly, so as not to provoke a sharp reaction, raised his hand, giving his warriors a clear signal to halt. His dwarves froze in place, as if rooted, their fingers whitened, gripping weapon hafts. In the ensuing silence they heard only their own ragged breathing and the quiet, rustling sound emanating from the multitude of these creatures, the sound of their skin sliding over stone. One of the troglodytes, slightly larger than the rest, detached from the general group and took several smooth, gliding steps forward, towards the dwarves. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, almost flowing, devoid of any sharpness. Large, completely black eyes with tin vertical pupils studied the newcomers attentively, without fear. It suddenly emitted a short series of rapid, clicking sounds which, reflected from the distant walls of the cavern, returned to it. This was ancient echolocation, helping it see in total absolute darkness better than any dwarf in daylight. The dwarves stood motionless, as if carved from stone, but each of them felt on the skin of their backs dozens of invisible, studying gazes sliding over their armor. They understood with perfect clarity this was not a chance encounter in the boundless underworld. The troglodytes knew of their approach long before and had consciously awaited them here, in this enormous, world-like cavern, which was apparently the heart of their ancestral territory. Brid, without taking his eyes off the troglodyte leader, slowly, demonstratively lowered the edge of his battle axe to the stone, but his gaze, heavy and appraising, did not leave the pale being. The next few moments, viscous as tar, would decide everything. Either they would pass this threshold peacefully, exchanging only glances, or the ancient vaults of this cavern would soon spill rivers of dark blood. The air between them froze, grew thick and heavy, as if nature itself had paused before an inevitable storm. At a barely noticeable movement of Brid's shoulder, the dwarves instantly and soundlessly closed their ranks, and the quiet cavern suddenly filled with a low, ringing hum of special music born of the contact of mithril armor and adamant shields. This was gear forged in the deepest and most sacred forges of Khazad-dûm, where long generations of masters had honed their art, passing secrets from father to son. Their great shields, forged of pure, unalloyed adamant, formed a solid, impenetrable wall before the band. The surface of each shield gleamed a deep dark gray with a barely perceptible bluish sheen, as if shards of night sky were trapped within. To fingers thick of an adult dwarf, they only seemed weightless due to incredibly skillful, near magical smithing. Along the very edges gleamed elegant, yet sturdiest reinforcements of mithril, a metal light as a feather, but in strength not inferior to the finest steel. In the calloused, strong hands of the dwarves, their famed battle axes stood ready for an instant swing. Some were entirely, from haft to lethal blade, forged of the same wondrous mithril. Carved, perfectly fitted hafts lay comfortably in their grit, and the double blades, honed to razor sharpness, shone with a cold, unearthly light, fiercely reflecting the leaping torch flames. The edge was so perfect that the cutting edge in the light seemed almost invisible, only the finest line promising certain death. The warrior's armor was a wondrous alloy of might and art. Mithril breastplates and pauldrons, polished to a mere shine, were riveted together with tiny, yet incredibly strong adamant bolts. Beneath them chimed, shimmering, male of the same mithril, woven with such unimaginable skill that each tiny ring link protected a dwarf no worse than a solid steel plate. Their helmets, adorned with fearsome adamant crests in the shape of stylized mountain peaks, hid their faces, leaving for the world only narrow, dark islets, from which the troglodytes were met by a firm, unshakable will. Everything changed in an instant, like a sudden cave-in in a deep shaft. The stone vaults of the cavern suddenly came alive, stir, and from numerous dark crevices, which earlier seemed merely natural cracks in the rock, dozens of pale bodies poured forth. The troglodytes did not advance in formation like dwarves, they fell upon them, in a veritable avalanche, moving with sharp, jerky lunges, like spiders suddenly startled from their web. Their long, bony limbs clung to stalactites hanging from the ceiling, allowing attacks from all directions at once, from above, to sides, even from behind. The first blow was taken by the adamant shields. A dull, heavy thud of many bodies striking metal rolled through the entire line, forcing the dwarves to retreat a step in unison. The creatures did not try to breach this metal wall. Instead, their long, tail fingers with dark claws slid along the shield edges, seeking the slightest gaps, chinks between them. One troglodyte, more agile than others, managed to thrust its scrawny arm through one such crack, trying to reach a dwarf's face. But a mithril axe descended from a short backswing, severing the limb at the elbow. The severed hand with still twitching fingers fell onto the stones, disappearing in the crush. Another creature, which jumped from a stalactite right into the center of the formation, was hacked to pieces by 3 axes simultaneously. Mithril blades entered the semi-transparent flesh almost soundlessly, cleaving it like mist. And dark, almost black blood spattered the nearest dwarven armor, spreading a sharp, unpleasant smell of damp, old earth, and rotting mushrooms. The dwarves chopped methodically, without unnecessary movements, conserving strength. Each blow was precise, calculated, and lethal. Troglodyte ribs cracked dryly under mithril blades, limbs parted from bodies, heads with their huge, indifferent eyes rolled across the uneven stone floor. But the creatures did not stop, did not retreat. Their large, pale luminous eyes glittered in the cavern's half-light with a blind, animal hatred. When a young dwarf in the front line, weary from strain, lowered his shield for a moment to catch his breath, one of the troglodytes immediately seized his helmet, beating its bony head furiously and ceaselessly against the sturdy visor. A neighboring warrior, seeing this, did not hesitate a second. His axe passed through the attacker's spine with a characteristic crunch, and the body slumped formlessly. The dwarves, having repelled this first fierce wave, began a slow, cautious, like a waking volcano, advance deeper into the cavern. Each step forward came with immense effort, underfoot bones crunched with a dried, twig-like snap, and dark, viscous, almost tarry blood, mingling with subterranean slime, formed a slippery, truly treacherous muck on the uneven stone floor. Even their mithril boots, these crowns of dwarven smithing art, with soles as reliable as bedrock, slipped on this bloody floor, forcing the warriors, accustomed to feeling stone through their soles, to choose their footing with particular, almost agonizing care. The cavern, as they advanced, yawned ever wider, revealing to view an ever more sinister and frightening picture emerging from the gloom. Like a nightmare from a sick mind, the high, receding vaults into impenetrable, almost tangible darkness were studded with stalactites, many covered in pale, nest, or cocoon-like formations. Troglodyte dwellings. These ulcers on the mountain's body. The walls, rough and wet, were riddled with countless dark passages, narrow, wound-like openings from which new and new waves of creatures continued to appear. Seemingly inexhaustible, born of the darkness itself, the air here thickened, became heavy to breathe, dense and suffocating, saturated with the smells of old, ancient mold, damp stone, and a sweetish, nauseating reek of death. Old Gromder, whose once snow-white, mountain snow-like beard was now covered with dark, already drying, skin-tightening spatters of black blood, met another troglodyte that darted from a narrow-side fissure with one precise, lightning-fast blow, holding all the weight of his lanyards and all his fury. His axe blade entered below the collarbone, cleaving the rib cage with a characteristic wet, smacking sound of tearing flesh. The creature fell onto his back, emitting a short, burgling sound like from an overturned jug, and went still, and in its glazed eyes remained nothing but emptiness. On the right flank, young Thorgan, his heart pounding like a trapped bird in his chest, barely managed to parry an attack from above. Shaking off a troglodyte clinging to his helmet, He drove his axe into its chest with a short, hoarse cry. The blade, flashing, exited from its back, striking a shower of blinding, yet heedless sparks off the stone floor. Shields to the right. Brid's voice cut through the battle's din, a voice holding no fear, only cold steel of duty. His command, spoken through the nose of combat, made the dwarves instantly, like parts of a single mechanism, realign. Repelling a new attack from a side tunnel, shields clanged together, taking the impact of another gray, hissing wave. With each step inward, resistance intensified, growing more desperate, fiercer. Troglodytes threw themselves at the shields, heedless of losses, and in their blind eyes burned only hunger. Their long, filthy fingers with hard, flint-like claws scratched the adamant, leaving barely visible, yet still humiliating marks on the gleaming surface. Sometimes several creatures managed to cling to one shield, and then the dwarves had to chop them down as they hung on the protective wall, like repulsive fruit on a branch. The cavern floor was littered with bodies, and this pile of bodies was a terrible monument to their path. Those that still stirred, emitting weak squeaks, received precise, merciless blows to the head. Black, tar-like blood-filled natural depressions in the stone, forming foul, steaming puddles reflecting the torchlight. The air hummed with the piercing, nerve-shredding shrieks of troglodytes and the steady, visceral hum of dwarven armor, a great hymn of battle born of steel and flesh. They continued their movement step by step, leaving behind a narrow, hard-won corridor of bodies, their mithril axes, already dulled from slaughter, relentlessly clearing a path deeper into the ancient cavern, into the very kingdom of stones, into the heart of darkness. It was a bloody, methodical, precise to the last swing dance of death in the very heart of the earth's stone belly. The dwarves of the Deep Wardens, these squat, mighty titans whose calling and curse was to guard the most remote, darkest minds, moved as a single, many-limbed organism, back to back, shoulder to shoulder, their lives intertwined in this hell. Their world shrank to a trembling ring of light, from smoking, crackling torches to the ringing, scarred wall of shields and the lethal arc of mithril axe swings. The cavern they finally entered was so vast it could have contained all of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, with its great hall and all chambers, with room left over for an abyss. Its vaults were lost in impenetrable heights, in a firmament of solid, living gloom where no ray, no glimmer reached, and this darkness pressed on the mind with the weight of eternity. And in this colossal, yawning emptiness, their small, ordered formation seemed a lonely island of reason and will in a boundless, soulless ocean of blind, ancient chaos. The air was dead and motionless, smelling not just of damp, but of age-old, oppressive mustiness of a tomb that had never known wind or a single ray of hope, and only their heavy, ragged, weary breathing violated this prehistoric silence, and the quiet, vile, creeping rustle of hundreds of pale bodies sliding over stone, a whisper louder than any battle cry. They walked, and under their boots crunched not just rock fragments, but troglodyte bones, breaking with a dried, short crack like kindling under a woodcutter's feet in a leafless forest. Dark, almost black blood, thick as cooling resin, formed a slippery, sticky muck underfoot, and even the reliable adamant soles, upon which whole kingdoms stood, slit, forcing the warriors with particular, strained care to choose where to step, as if walking on thin ice over an abyss. Young Thorgan, whose face under the heavy helmet was drenched in acrid, salty sweat and sticky spatters of alien blood, felt his muscles burning with fatigue, sire, his heart hammering like a forge hammer in the Deep Warden smithy, beating out a furious, panicked rhythm. He chopped not at creatures, he chopped at this pressing, hostile darkness itself. He chopped at the fear squeezing his throat with icy fingers, fear that whispered surrender, to lie down and die. Each swing of his axe, through which semi-transparent flesh parted soundlessly and bones crunched like eggshells, was not just killing, it was an affirmation, struck in steel. We are here. We are the Wardens. We will not break. Old Gromder, standing to his left, shoulder to shoulder, breathed evenly and heavily like forge bellows, and moved with terrifying, almost machine-like precision, devoid of all rage. His axe, half again heavier than Thorgan's, described short, economical, lethal arcs, and with each swing another pale, hissing body flew away, maimed and silent. His gray beard, his snow-white pride, was smeared with sticky, dark slime like decomposed meat, but in his eyes, visible in the helmet slits like two coals in ashes, burned not the fire of fury, but a cold, steady light of resolve forged and temper over long centuries of service in the most remote, silent shafts where stone whispered with alien, forgotten voices. And at the head of all, like a grim and immobile bastion, stood Brid Stoneheart. He did not chop with the reckless fury of the young, nor conserve strength like the old. His movements were like tectonic shifts, unhurried, inexorable, filled with grim and silent certainty, as if the earth itself dictated its rhythm to him. His axe descended, and it seemed not he guided the weapon, but the mountain itself, through his agency, brought its ancient wrath down upon these pale, lisping vermin. He felt not just every breath of his warriors, but every groan of armor, every stifled death rattle of the wounded, every shift in the pressure of the gloomy air. He was the brain and heart of this steel organism, this living fortress, slowly but inexorably advancing forward, into the very den of the unknown that pulsed ahead like a festering wound. Their ranks, dense and disciplined, were like a giant, relentless drill biting into the mass of the enemy host. Troglodytes, these living shadows, surged wave after wave, and it seemed they would have no end. Like the tide in a subterranean sea, they fell, pierced and cleaved, their huge, blind, luminous eyes winking out one by one like stars in night sky. But from the dark, from countless fissures, new ones appeared, born of the darkness itself. Sometimes one of the creatures, nimbler and more desperate than others, managed to sink its long, bony fingers into the edge of a shield, and then a dwarf had to knock it off with a short, sharp blow of the haft so a neighbor could finish it. And the screech of claws on adamant sounded like a knife on glass. Shields, close shields. Brid's hoarse cry rang out, his voice low and thick as molten metal roaring over the general battle din, cutting through the hum and shrieks. The adamant wall shifted even tighter with a loud, final clang, shield to shield, edge to edge. Now they were like a huge, slowly crawling turtle, whose shell was invulnerable, whose claws were lethal. They breathed as one, a deep, nosy inhale, a short, resilient step, a slashing blow, inhale, step, blow. This rhythm, this ancient, mountain-old battle rhythm of the Deep Wardens, became their only reality, their prayer and their curse. They no longer saw individual opponents, only a pale, stirring, endless mass that had to be destroyed to clear a path forward, to the mystery hiding in the heart of this monstrous cavern, to that which, Brid felt in his bones, awaited them at the end of this path, cold and inexorable. And they advanced, leaving behind a broad, bloody trail, a corridor of bodies and shattered bones, slowly, as befitted their race, whose time flowed unhurried like an underground river, and whose will was harder than any most ancient stone. They continued their slow, inexorable movement into the stone belly, and it seemed the mountain itself, alive and malevolent, tried to spit them back out with this endless mash of bones and flesh. Beyond the first colossal cavern opened a second, then a third, a whole suite of underground chambers connected by narrow, throat-like passages where the dwarven formation was forced to contract, turning into a steel, blood-polished wedge that fanned out again upon entering another yawning void, where the air was heavier yet and smelled of death even more ancient. These halls were not empty. Hundreds, thousands of pale, stirring silhouettes met them in each, their luminous eyes like a swarm of 6 stars in the subterranean night. The troglodytes no longer rushed in single, desperate lunges. Now they surged in a solid, living, silent wall, and in their attack appeared a sinister tactic born of a collective, alien mind. They clung with long, bony fingers tipped with dark, needle-sharp claws not only to shields, but to the armor of neighbors, trying to shake the unshakable formation with their weight. Their faceless mass, they hung in clusters on the adamant wall, and the dwarves had to work their axes with short, exhausting swings, hacking off these tenacious limbs, which even in death did not unclench, continuing to scratch the metal in a death spasm, leaving thin, whitish marks on it like memory of this day. The air hummed with their whisper inarticulate, hissing, full of a blind, ancient hatred that had festered in these halls longer than whole human kingdoms lived. This sound needled the ears with thin, invisible needles, seeped through the narrow slits of helmets, pressed on consciousness no less than the pressing stone mass above their heads, filling the skull with a vile, obsessive buzzing. The smell was unbearable, thick and tangible, the acrid stench of torn entrails, sweetish and putrid like spoiled meat, mingled with the pungent, eye-stinging smoke of torches and the familiar, almost homely smell of the dwarves' own sweat and blood, the smell of iron and salt. Young Thorgan, no longer feeling fatigue but only a single, fiery, trembling tension in every muscle, suddenly felt an icy, burning stripe of pain on his thigh. One of the troglodytes, wriggling under the very shield, sinuous and quick as a snake, had managed to drag its long, filthy claw along the joint between cuisse and breastplate. The blow was shallow but searingly cold, as if touched by a shard of eternal ice from the deepest mines. Thorgan, without thinking, driven by a mere animal impulse to survive, drove the point of his axe into the huge, luminous, swamp fire-like eye of the creature, and it, emitting a short, gurgling, desperate cry, crawled away to die in the dark, taking his blood on its claw. "Hold fast, lad," old Gromder rasped through the battle nose, and his heavy axe momentarily shielded Thorgan from a new attack, cleaving a creature leaping from the side with a wet, juicy smack. "Their nest is somewhere close. Feel it? The air's changing." And indeed, a new, even more revolting note appeared in the stench, the smell of ammonia and something sour, like spoiled milk. Brid Stoneheart, standing at the wedge's point, unshakable as a crag, felt it best of all. With each new haul, each repelled attack, he felt how the very flesh of the mountain around changed, grew ever more alien, sick. The walls here were not just rough and uneven. They were riddled with those same pale, giant wasp nest or cocoon-like formations they had seen from afar. Some were torn open, oozing the same black, viscous, tarry slime as from the troglodyte bodies. Others, fresher, stirred weakly, as if from the breath of a sleeping monstrosity. And from them crawled forth new, even scrawnier and paler, almost transparent creatures, to immediately, with a piercing hiss, blind and furious, hurl themselves into battle. This was not just a lair. This was a nursery, an incubator, the pulsing heart of all this vile, swarming life. And the dwarves, these uninvited guests, who came with light and steel, methodically, with persistence worthy of their legendary, proverbial stubbornness, were hacking and burning it to the ground, piece by piece. They did not merely fight back, they were cleansing, leaving no stone upon stone, no creature upon creature. Each step forward, heavy and hard one, was a step towards the utter annihilation of this stone kingdom of darkness. When the formation advanced, several dwarves with blazing torches, shielded by comrades, approached the walls and set these pale, leathery nests ablaze. Fire reluctantly took the strange, sinewy material, hissing and crackling, but when it caught, it flared fiercely, in short, bright bursts, spreading a new, acrid smell of charred flesh and bitter decay, filling the halls with a mournful, crimson glare in which the shadows of the fighters danced like demons. Underfoot crunched not only bones gnawed, but some brittle, hollow structures breaking with a thin, almost glassy tinkle, perhaps petrified eggs or larvae holding the embryos of future evil. Black, oily blood mixed with sticky slime, forming a dangerous, slippery, bubbling film underfoot. That the dwarves, forged in eternal, endless battles underground, did not stumble. Their movement was like the work of a giant, well-oiled mechanism, fearsome, inexorable, and ruthlessly precise. Their battle cry no longer sounded. There was no air in their lungs for loud shouts. There was only heavy, hoarse, wheezing breath, the dry clang of metal on metal, the crunch of breaking bones, the death hiss of dying vermin, and the steady, powerful, almost musical hum their mithril armor gave off from hundreds of blows, an ancient song of steel, wordlessly telling of the strength and inflexibility of their people. They were cleansing this accursed kingdom of stones, turning it from a stronghold of ancient, nameless evil into yet another dead, silent, smoke-impregnated monument to the unbreakable might of the dwarven foe. And ahead, beyond the next turn, awaited only new, even thicker darkness, yet more hissing vermin. And, as Brid felt with cold, stony certainty growing in his breast, the answer to the mystery hiding in the very heart of this endless, living night. In his breast, under the heavy, newly scarred mithril breastplate, where only the flame of battle fury should have burned, now lived another, deeper and more inexorable feeling, breaking through the battle's din. It was not a voice, not a call in the usual sense, rather, a persistent, nagging rhythm pulsing in time with the dull beats of his own heart, a low, hollow droning emanating not from his ears, but from his very bones, from the depths of his bloodline's memory, from times when the mountains were young. It was like the distant, muffled roar of an underground cave-in, or the imperious whisper of a rich or vein luring a miner into the most dangerous depths. And this ancient, stone call pulled him forward, through holes drenched in blood and stench, past burning nests and heaps of bodies, ever deeper, into those silent, slumbering layers of stone mass where no dwarf's foot had trod. And he led them, this old warrior, whose will was harder than adamant. Hundreds of dwarves of the Deep Warden clan, weary to the last sinew, wounded, with armor scratched like a map of past battles, but unbroken in spirit. They did not see this call, did not hear its mysterious, nagging music that sounded only in their leader's consciousness. They saw only his back broad, impenetrable, drenched in the crimson reflections of torches and the dark, already congealing blood of troglodytes. They saw his famed axe, which rose and fell with inhuman, almost ritual inevitability, cleaving both semi-transparent flesh and the congealed darkness on their path. And this sight, this silent certainty, was enough for them. Not a single question, not a single doubt escaped their parched lips, was read in their devoted, weary, yet still clear eyes. For Brid Stoneheart was to them not just a commander giving orders. He was a living legend, flesh of the flesh of that inflexible wool that had carved great kingdoms from unyielding cliffs. They remembered, as if by rote, him at the northern gates, when the countless hordes of Grizzlix goblins had furiously tried to breach sacred Nar-Uzdum-Arak. And he, then a young commander, had stood to the death on a narrow bridge for 3 long days, until the awaited reinforcements arrived. They remembered how he alone, without food or water, spent 3 weeks in the collapsed mine of Nalabaruz, surviving in absolute darkness and constant cave-ins, just a safe kin trapped in a stone trap. His valor and courage were not empty words from old sagas to them. They were carved on the walls of their fortresses and in the deepest depths of their hearts, tempered in real battles and tested by long years of ruthless, harsh service. Therefore, when he now led them into this utter, living darkness, to what seemed certain doom, they followed, blindly, unquestioningly. For if Brid Stoneheart led them somewhere, then it was there, in the very inferno of the subterranean hell, that their duty, their fate, and the honor of their entire clan lay. And they annihilated, sparing none. They became an instrument of retribution, a scourge fallen upon this ancient, forgotten by all kingdom. The troglodytes, breeding here in safety and silence for whole millennia, had never encountered a force of this kind, not the blind fury of orcs, but a cold, methodical, almost ritual slaughter. Every hall, every cavern, every dark, damp corner where pale, semi-transparent life stirred, now met a solid steel wall that did not retreat, but only advanced, inexorably, step by step, yard by yard, leaving behind only silent mounds of mutilated bodies, and a tomb-like silence in which only the crackling of burning, stinking nests sounded. They followed their leader into the very thick of ancient evil, and in their silent obedience was not the blind faith of slaves, but the deepest, battle-tested and blood-earned respect. They believed that his stone heart felt the very beating of the mountain, and if it led them inward, then something important for them, for their future, lay there. And they were ready to follow him even to the very edge of the underworld. The troglodytes did not learn, drew no conclusions from the death of their kin. They developed no new tactics, did not try to deceive or outmaneuver. Their onslaught was like a natural phenomenon, blind, merciless, and endless as a sudden rockfall. They did not advance in formation. They emerged, born of the darkness itself. One of the shield-bearers, in the 3rd rank, a mighty bearded dwarf with an old scar across his left eye, suddenly cried out, sure and more surprise than pain. From the ceiling, from some unseen crevice in the stalactite-riddled vault, 3 creatures dropped down. They fell on him with their full weight like overripe, burst fruit, clinging to his back and shoulders, their long, bony, cold limbs wrapping around his armor with incredible, beast-like strength. Before neighbors could react, they had already sunk sharp claws into the narrow gaps of his plate, desperately pulling and shaking, trying to reach the soft, vulnerable flesh beneath the reliable mithril. A deafening, furious roar sounded not of pain, but of humiliating rage. 2 dwarves to left and right turned, and their axes, flashing in the uneven torchlight, found their marks. 2 pale bodies dropped, but the 3rd, most agile, managed to slip a narrow hand under the edge of the comrade's helmet. A wet, smacking, nightmarish sound was heard, and the mighty shield-bearer slowly, like a felled ancient tree, sank to his knees. His shield fell onto the bloodied stones with a dull, final crash. Rear ranks, tighter. Brid growled without turning, as if seeing everything behind him with his back. His own axe at that moment described a short, lethal arc, felling another troglodyte that darted from a narrow, almost invisible side fissure unnoticed in the battle's chaos. Flanking attacks became the grim norm. From side galleries, dark as chasms into nothingness, now spilled small, nimble bands of 5 to 7 creatures. They did not rush head-on at the unbreakable shields. They tried to slip between warriors, cling to legs, hamstrings, bite, scratch did anything to disrupt the flawless formation, to cause chaos and panic within it. Young Thorgan, standing on the right flank, defended himself no longer with shattering swings, but with short, jerky, precise jabs, as if fending off a swarm of persistent, lethal insects. His shield was scored with deep, whitish scratches, and on his pauldron, like a disgusting trophy, dangled a severed hand with long, dark, hook claws. That the dwarven formation, drilled by years, was like a living, shimmering crystal monolithic, yet capable of instantly, at a barely perceptible gesture or hoarse command from the leader, restructuring, ranks closed, turned, repelling threats from new directions with stunning coordination. But it cost them their last strength. Everyone's breathing became whizzing, ragged, tearing from their chests with a rasp. Acrid sweat streamed into their eyes, mingling with soot and sticky spatters of alien blood. But they did not stop. There could be no thought of stopping. Their descent into the depths turned into a nightmarish, multi-layered battle on 3 fronts, where every moment required splitting one's attention. Straight ahead, pressing against shields, surged the main, teeming mass of troglodytes from the flanks, from yawning black tunnels. Their fierce, desperate sorties continued, and above their very heads, in the stalactite-riddled heights, lurked the constant, inexorable threat of falling from the ceiling. The tons of their torch flames, rising upward, snatched from the impenetrable gloom for but a moment, now pale, slime-covered prehensile paw gripping a limestone flowstone, now pair of huge, luminous eyes with a cold phosphorescent glow, dispassionately and greedily watching them from above, waiting for the moment for a lethal leap. The air with each new step downward became different, alien, unfit for the breathing of living things. Pressure grew inexorably, clogging ears with thick, pressing cotton, ringing in the skull. The smell of old, age-old down, and rampant fungus gradually gave way to something sharper, metallic, almost electric, with a distinct taste of ozone and ancient, untouched stone that had never known wind or sunray. The light of their torches, once fierce and confident, no longer cast distant, dancing shadows. It was greedily swallowed by the thickening, congealing darkness, viscous and heavy like black, stagnant water in an underground lake. And through all this hell, through all-consuming weariness, gnawing pain, and deafening battle roar, Brid Stoneheart continued inexorably to lead them downward, into the very bowels of the earth. His figure, unshakable and grim as one of the menhirs, was their only landmark, their guiding star in this subterranean kingdom of madness and despair. He walked without looking back, and they followed him, because for them there simply existed no alternative. To stop here meant to be buried alive under an endless pile of these creatures' corpses. To turn back meant to betray their duty and the only one who led them through any, even the most unimaginable horror. And so they descended ever deeper, into the very belly of the world, where the air was thick as syrup, and the darkness dense and tangible as a wall. And so, at last, exhausted to the limit, covered in abrasions, sticky sweat, and dry, alien blood, but unbroken in spirit, they emerge onto the very edge of a vast, yawning icy emptiness of a subterranean chasm. Before them, suddenly gaping, yawned a colossal fissure, black as eternity itself, and so deep that the trembling, weary light of their last torches sank helplessly into its bottomless maw. Unable to even touch the bottom, the air here was utterly different, damp, heavy, saturated with finest water dust, and filled with a deafening, low, ceaseless roar of invisible, yet felt with the whole being turbulent water. The chasm was cleft by this furious underground current, which with a dull, unceasing thunder, like the heartbeat of a sleeping colossus, carved its way through the massive age-old cliffs, shattering against giant water polished to a mirror boulders with ancient fury. The vaults above this abyss were lost in impenetrable, absolute darkness, and only a distant, barely perceptible, frost-like light of pale luminous moss growing in patches on the sheer walls indicated the dizzying, unimaginable height of this stone well plunging into the world's very bowels. Brid halted at the very edge of the precipice, his gaze heavy and piercing, directed not downward, but forward, across the yawning void. There, on the opposite side, in the sheer wall of the chasm, gaped a black opening, a low, wide entrance to a cavern, from whence emanated that silent call that had relentlessly, like a chain, drawn him ever deeper inward. And between their ledge and that entrance, over the roaring abyss, spanned a stone bridge, ancient, massive, hewn from the very rock as if a giant's hand had once flung it across the chasm as a challenge to the void. It was narrow, barely wider than to dwarves shoulder to shoulder, devoid of any railings, and its surface, polished by eternal moisture and time, gleamed in the torchlight with a dull, dangerous mirror sheen. Holding their breath, the dwarves looked around, and their weary but keen eyes, accustomed from infancy to the eternal half-dark of minds, slowly began to discern in the ghostly, shimmering light of mosses and smoking torches something that made hearts that had seen all sights, and grown used to the dazzling glitter of any treasure still. The chasm walls seemed carved from a solid, living starch art. Everywhere, as far as the eye could see, thick veins of rarest, legendary ores twisted and pulsed with inner light. Here amethyst streaks gleamed with deep violet velvet. There, like frozen lightning of the primordial world, shone inclusions of ethereal, iridescent pearl. Higher, in the dark, loomed the sinister, light-absorbing sheen of ebonite, and beside it the shimmering, like a great dragon's scales, wondrous surface of dragonite. This was not just a treasury, this was the very heart of the dwarven world, a fairy tale become reality, silent yet eloquent confirmation of all ancient legends passed down for centuries in their kin. Thy forge fires, that the exultation born in the soul at the sight of such boundless, legendary riches was immediately, almost instantly, replaced by the cold, tenacious grip of old, mountain-age dwarven common sense. Such a fine, gleaming in the very heart of the enemy's lair, could not be unguarded, could not be given freely. And the bridge, this sole path hanging over doom, was too obvious and terrible a trap. Brid, wasting not a single precious second, gave the order. His voice, hoarse from weariness and eternal subterranean stench, cut through the thundering, water-dust-saturated silence of the chasm with its usual iron clarity, as if striking words from the stone itself. Gromder, he threw out shortly, and the old warrior, whose beard was caked in dry, cracked slime and alien blood, heaved up but without delay approached, leaning on the haft of his notched axe serving as both weapon and staff. Hold the entrance. 3 rings. Not a single shadow breaks through here. Gromder only nodded silently, his eyes deep sunk under the helmet's brim, meeting the commander's gaze for a moment. And in this silent exchange was everything: understanding, acceptance, and unshakable will. He was accustomed to trusting Brid's every word as he trusted the reliability of an adamant shield. Brid, meanwhile, stood at the very edge of the ledge, 2 steps from the beginning of the ancient stone arch. He peered into the darkness awaiting on the other side of the chasm, veiled by a moving curtain of mist born of the furious stream somewhere below. The stone bridge, narrow and railing-less, stretched forward, losing sharpness of outline in this damp haze, and its far end dissolved into the black, yawning maw of the cavern on the opposite wall. He felt the call now as tangibly as never before, not as a sound, but as physical attraction, a cold, insistent pulsation in his very bones. It came from there, from that darkness, simultaneously beckoning and menacing, like the quiet voice of the mountain itself awakened from long sleep. No complex plans, no risky rope climbs were required. Before him lay a direct, mute challenge, ancient stone underfoot, the abyss on either side, and the goal ahead, a path flung like a test by fate itself. And while their leader, without looking back, took the first heavy, confident step onto the time and water-polished surface of the bridge, slowly beginning to dissolve into the misty veil, the dwarves under Gromder were already executing their part of the task. Their duty was clear. Nothing living or unliving must break through here from the depths they had just left, from the winding tunnels still swarming with echoes of recent slaughter. They were to hold this line, secure the rear, be the unshakable rock against which any wave would break, and preserve a path for retreat, if needed. Adamant shields, scored with fresh scratches and dark, sticky stains of troglodyte blood, with a dull, weighty, final thud, stood flush against the rough cliffs on either side of the narrow passage through which they had entered the chasm. They turned this natural threshold into a semblance of impregnable iron gates, beyond which the familiar world ended and the kingdom of ore and gleaming ores began. Behind this gleaming wall, into dense rows, warriors stood ready. They were covered on the flanks by the chasm's own stone breast, their formation like a wedge driven into the cave's throat. They did not watch with their gaze the lone figure of their leader, vanishing into the mist. Their faces, hidden in the deep shadow of heavy helmets, were immobile and turned the other way, into the very impenetrable, oppressive dark of the abandoned tunnel that had led them to this gleaming edge. The air in that passage now seemed motionless and thick, saturated with the smell of stirred dust, sharp blood, and distant decay. But the silence hanging there was deceptive. It rang in their ears with tension, like a taut bowstring of a great bow, ready at any moment to snap and send death into the formation's very heart. And that silence soon shattered. The attack came from where expected, from the blackness of the abandoned galleries. First, it was just rustlings, light, whispering, like dry leaves driven by an underground wind. Then to the rustlings was added a quiet, abrupt scraping of claws on stone. And finally, they poured forth pale, merging with the rock-textured troglodytes. They did not advance in formation. They appeared from every crevice, slid from the vaults, flowed from side branches, silent and numerous as the darkness itself. A dull, heavy thud of bodies against the solid wall of shields rolled through the narrow passage. The dwarves took the blow, bracing their feet against stone, locking shoulders. Their formation shuddered but did not yield. The troglodytes did not try to breach this metal barrier, they pressed against it, with all their blind, inexhaustible mass, trying to crush, topple with weight. Long, bony fingers with sharp, awl-like claws slid along shield edges, seeking joints, trying to hook and pull a plate aside, opening a breach. One troglodyte, agile and scrawny, managed to thrust an arm through a narrow gap between shield and rock, trying to seize the leg of a dwarf standing behind. But immediately, flashing in the dim torchlight, a mithril axe descended. The blow was short, chopping. A dry, branch-like crack sounded, and the severed hand, still twitching, fell into the dust. Gromder, standing at the formation's center, did not shout, did not encourage. His low, gravelly voice, like stones rolling, gave one and the same command: measure and clear. Close up, hold, chop. His own axe, heavy and notched, described not why. Lethal arcs over the shields, there was no room. These were precise, putting all the strength of the torso into each blow, every one finding its mark. A pale neck, a head pressed against a shield, a tenacious limb. Black, thick blood spattered on the adamant surface, streaming in oily rivulets. The formation worked like a single, breathing organism. When one dwarf, taking on his shield the furious pressure of several creatures, retreated half a step, a neighbor immediately shifted, substituting his shield, closing the forming breach. Warriors of the second rank, standing half-turned, struck over the heads of the first. Their axes fell upon those troglodytes, trying to clamber over the shield wall or cling to its upper edge. The ring of metal, the crunch of breaking bones, death hisses, and the heavy, hoarse breathing of dwarves merged into one continuous, deafening hymn of battle in the tight stone throat. The troglodytes did not learn, did not retreat. They fell, pierced and cleaved, their bodies piling upon each other before the shields, forming a slippery, stirring rampart. But from the dark behind them appeared new ones, just as pale, just as faceless and furious. They scrambled over the bodies of their kin, trying to surmount the barrier, fell from above from the vaults, clinging to helmets and pauldrons. A young dwarf on the left flank, losing vigilance for a moment, allowed one creature to sink long fingers into the edge of his helmet. The creature yanked furiously, trying to tear off the protection, its hissing muzzle an inch from his face. But before a neighbor could react, Gromder, as if sensing this private threat with his back, with a short, backhand swing of his axe half drove the iron pommel into the troglodyte's temple. The skull crunched, the body went limp and hung. Press! Gromder snarled, and the formation, like a single giant, took a short, powerful step forward, pushing back the pile of bodies, clearing a little space before the shields. This gave the dwarves a gasp of air, a moment's respite to close ranks tighter. Check if armor was damaged. Underfoot bones crunched, slippery, dark mass slid. The smell was unbearable, acrid. Swedish putrid stench of torn entrails mingled with pungent dust and the smell of sweat. And behind their backs, in the ringing silence of the chasm broken only by the eternal roar of water, the lone figure of Brid Stoneheart moved ever farther along the stone bridge, step by step approaching the black maw on the other side. The roar of battle in the narrow passage must have reached him as a muffled, distant echo, but he did not turn. His back, straight and unshakable, was for them simultaneously a symbol of duty and a sign that their sacrifice, their fear standing here in this tight trap, had meaning. They were holding the door, so that he could pass, so that the call that had led him through miles of darkness would at last find its voice. Brid, step by step, slowly but inexorably, moved forward into the mist, towards the black maw. His path lay across the ancient stone bridge, across the very brink between torchlight and the darkness awaiting in the cavern, on the other side of the chasm. And so he reached his goal. The cavern he entered was broad, receding deep into the cliff. The air here was utterly still and dried, smelling of ozone as after a distant storm, and of ancient, untouched stone. Brid slowly, almost tenderly ran a gauntleted hand over the nearest wall, feeling beneath the rough cloth the smooth, almost polished, unnatural surface. This was not the work of wind or water, nor of his kin's chisels. Something else, alien, had given the stone this strange, inexplicable texture. He took his trusted battle-axe from his mighty shoulder. The weapon settled confidently into his accustomed palm, and its weight was comfortingly familiar, like the handshake of an old friend. The blade of purest mithril, which seemed not to have dulled since his great-grandfather's time, faintly reflected the dull, ghostly light coming from somewhere deep within the cavern, a cold, phosphorescent, lifeless glow, and that very call that had led him through miles of stone mass, here, in this cavern, became almost tangible, physically pressing. It emanated now not from his ears, but vibrated in his very bones, filled his skull with a low, inaudible yet distinctly felt humming, coming from without. Brid, without hesitation, took the first firm step forward, then another. His heavy, measured steps echoed dully in the tomb-like silence of the cavern. He did not look back at his fighting kin, did not think of return. His path lay only forward, towards what awaited him in the very heart of this mysterious glow, in the epicenter of the call that had at last found its real, earthly source. Having gone about 50 yards along a low but wide tunnel, Brid emerged into a vast, yawning void of a hull, and his dwarven, keen eye, accustomed since childhood to assessing any subterranean space, instantly noted with disbelief the complete, absolute unnaturalness of this place. The cavern's vaults were perfectly spherical, smooth, as if blown from liquid stone by a giant, invisible bubble. Walls and floor were polished to a mirror, blinding sheen, but not by a familiar chisel or hammer, but by something else, alien, that left behind a smooth, black glass-like surface. In the very center of the hall, at its very heart, emanated that very phosphorescent glow, a cold, diffuse, lifeless light having no visible source, no warmth, which cast ghostly, distorted shadows and made the mithril of his armor gleam with a dull, funereal silver. And in the very heart of this ghostly light, legs crossed in an imperturbable pose, sat a dwarf. He was clad in simple, almost ascetic robes resembling coarse, undyed canvas, but woven from something that only deceptively imitated cloth, at times shimmering on the edge of vision and losing clear outlines like mist. He sat in perfect stillness, and in his posture was not mere relaxation, but complete, absolute harmony with the surrounding stone, as if he were its integral, animate part. Grown from the rock, Brid halted, his scarred fingers instinctively tightening on the worn axe haft. In his long life he had seen dwarves of many clans and all ages, from young minors to decrepit elders, but this one was utterly different. From him emanated an almost tangible aura of immense antiquity, a ringing silence in which the slow passage of millennia could be heard. The being raised its head with the same smooth, unhurried inevitability with which the earth's firmness rises and falls. Its eyes, dark and bottomless as the deepest mines, met Brid's intent gaze, and then it spoke, and its voice was low and deep, like the echo of a distant, subterranean cave-in. But in it was none of the familiar stony hoarseness of a dwarf, nor anything else familiar to a living ear. "I have been waiting for you, Brid of the Deep Wardens clan." The silence that followed these words was thicker, heavier, and denser than any darkness they had passed in their wanderings. The air in the cavern froze, ceasing to vibrate, and even the eternal, deafening roar of battle from the chasm seemed now muffled and infinitely distant, as if coming from another world. Brid's stone heart, whose iron will had not faltered before countless hordes of troglodytes, felt something cold, heavy, and utterly unfamiliar squeeze his old, battle-hardened heart. His own name, spoken by this being, sounded not as a simple greeting or question, but as a statement of an inescapable, predestined fact, accomplished long before his birth. Brid did not move from his spot, his scar and calloused fingers gripping the axe haft with force capable of crushing a cave troll's skull. But here, in this unnaturally smooth, polished to a gleam cavern, his trusty weapon suddenly seemed to him helpless and absurd. Like a child's toy in an adult's hands, he felt no emanating threat in the usual, earthly sense, no malice, no blind bloodlust. From the being before him emanated something else, far more frightening, a bottomless, all-consuming depth of calm, comparable only to the sight of endless starry sky suddenly opening in the depths of an underground grotto. His battle instinct, forged in countless skirmishes with goblins and troglodytes, stilled, suppressed by a burning, soul-chilling curiosity and reverent awe. He studied it, this dwarf who was not a dwarf, at least not as Brid knew them. Its garments seemed carved from shadow itself and sewn by the cavern's mysterious light. They lay in impeccable, frozen folds, not stirring in the motionless, dead air. The long beard, braided with artistry inaccessible even to the most skilled dwarven masters, seemed carved from a single piece of black obsidian. But most of all, Brid, accustomed to reading truth in the eyes of friends and foes, was struck by its eyes. In them was neither friendliness nor enmity, nor even simple curiosity, only a calm, all-encompassing, indifferent knowledge from which blood froze in the veins and chilled the soul. This frightened him, the hardened warrior, far more than the furious roar of a whole host of troglodytes. The being showed not a trace of impatience, observing the dwarf's inner struggle and slowness. Its hand, long and graceful, rose in a smooth, unhurried gesture reminiscent of the movement of underground waters that wear away the hardest stone over millennia. A pale palm indicated an opposite flat, table-like stone, polished to a mirror sheen, in which the cavern's shimmering glow was reflected dully and distortedly. "Sit, Brid Stoneheart," the voice sounded again, like the dull rumble of ancient cliffs remembering the very birth of the world. In these unhurried words was neither threat nor request, only a heavy, pressing inevitability, comparable to the pressure of thousands of tons of mountain rock. "Our conversation will be long, and it will open your eyes to what is truly happening with this world you consider your home." In the ensuing pause, thick as pitch, Brid imagined a sinister, high ringing in his ears as if the last, finest thread still restraining the encroaching chaos in his soul had snapped. "Hearken, son of stone," the being's voice sounded anew, like a distant yet inexorable cave-in the mountain's depths, "and hear what the most ancient, mute layers of rock keep silent about. The mountains you have called eternal and unshakable supports of the world since childhood. Their allotted time has already expired." After these inconceivable words, it seemed to Brid for a moment that the cavern walls shuddered slightly, almost imperceptibly, though the cold stone beneath his feet remained absolutely motionless and hard. "The air in your deepest minds," the being continued indifferently, "the very air that for centuries filled the lungs of all your folk, will soon become poison to you, slow and merciless. And that darkness, which stirs and hisses in the near depths of your stone kingdom, is but a weak, pitiful echo of what approaches from the very foundations of existence, from those places where no ray, no breath has ever reached." Brid, obeying not an external command but a sudden heaviness shackling his legs, slowly, like an old man, lowered himself onto the indicated stone. The freezing cold of the polished surface instantly seeped through the steel plates of his armor and mail. His broad palms, accustomed to the perfectly polished, living haft of an axe, now lay helplessly on his knees, feeling an unfamiliar, oppressive emptiness. He felt himself in that moment not a feigned warrior come for answers with weapon in hand, but an uncomprehending pupil first crossing the threshold of a great and terrible temple, where every word, every sound acquired a universal, unbearable significance. The air in the cavern was thick, heavy, and utterly motionless, smelling of ozone after a great storm, and ancient, untouched stone that had lain in silence for entire epochs. The silence here was a special, living substance, not a mere absence of sound, but a hostile entity actively muffling the distant, furious roar of battle and the steady, eternal thunder of the waterfall. Through this oppressive, dense silence the being's voice cut with frightening, unnatural clarity, and each word bit into his very consciousness like a red-hot nail driven into fresh wood. The words about the impending fall of the mountains, these eternal supports, echoed in Brid's very soul with an icy, piercing horror. For a dwarf, whose whole life from birth to death's hour was inseparably linked with stone, the very thought of its fragility, its transience, was more terrible than the most agonizing death. This was an assault on the very foundation of his being, on that stronghold in which he had sought and found support all his long life. "Your world, Brid Stoneheart, hangs by the finest thread," the voice continued, and its sound was like the grinding of tectonic plates. "The clock is counting down the last grains of time allotted for preparation. The hour has come to see clearly and behold with your own eyes upon what razor's edge of an abyss all you call living now stands." The being slowly, with unearthly grace, raised its pale hand, and in this simple gesture was a strange, infinitely sorrowful solemnity, as if before performing an ancient and mournful rite. "This darkness that approaches knows neither borders nor mercy. Your kin will not hide behind the thickest stone walls of the deepest thundercrafts, Elves will find no shelter in the thickest thickets of their eternal forest. Their ancient, proud magic will dim and crumble before this absolute glue. As for humans, humans are easiest to break, for their hearts, unlike your stone, waver like reeds in the wind. And their will is inconstant. When the great, legendary alliance of the three peoples fell, the very pillars of being upon which the world rested trembled and shook. And now from this deep crack in reality itself crawled forth an evil, against which the most tempered steel and the mightiest spells are powerless. The one who came. The being's voice trembled for the first time. A shadow of something resembling fear audible in it. He is one of the 12 ancients, demigods. They were summoned by the gods themselves as keepers of balance, guardians of order. But this one, whose name I will not yet speak, has resolved to rewrite the very book of being according to his will. He is gathering an army that will burn everything to the ground, every breath of life, every spark that dares stand in the way of his black design. How do you know all this? Brid's voice sounded muffled from under drawn brass, but in it, like a steel core, his habitual firmness was heard. His fingers involuntarily clenched into fists, as if again feeling the familiar, comforting weight of his mithril axe haft. The being, maintaining the imperturbability of a granite boulder, inclined its head slightly. In its bottomless eyes, deep as the most abandoned mines of Khazad-dûl, Surdchan shimmered a bottomless, age-old sorrow. I came into this world simultaneously with him, almost in the same moment. The measured answer sounded, each word like a precise pickaxe blow against the hardest ore. And have awaited your coming all this long time. He made a small but significant pause, letting the dwarf comprehend the weight of what was said. We all, the 12 ancient guardians, possess our own part of existence, our own element. One commands the element of fire, another the waters of oceans, a third feeds on mortal souls, drawing strength from them, each of us at our own, strictly allotted role in maintaining the world's fragile balance. The being's voice lowered to a whisper that, however, was heard as clearly as a shout. But now this ancient balance is shattered to its foundations. The one whom you in your ignorance call simply darkness has rejected his original duty, and desires to subjugate all that is, to become its sole master. So you are one of these demigods? Brid asked, and in his usually firm voice sounded genuine, childlike amazement for the first time. He slowly, almost reluctantly, set aside his mithril axe, and the trusty weapon with a dull, submissive thud lay upon the polished stone floor. Why then did you wait here, in this wilderness, for me? A mere dwarf. You are the one whose will is harder than the purest adamant. The indifferent answer sounded. The being's voice was like the distant yet inexorable rumble of an underground cave-in. The one capable of standing unbroken in the coming battle and leading others, instilling in them your steadfastness. Your name appeared in the book of being as soon as the pillars of this world began to crumble. And why should I believe you? The dwarf persisted, and his eyes, accustomed to seeing deceit and trickery even in the darkest tunnels, bored into the being's immobile face with intent, studying attention. Your words sound to my ear like a tale pulled by the hearth on long evenings, to make timid children behave and obey their elders. True belief is born not from heard words, but from personal vision, from experience. The being slowly, smoothly extended its pale, almost translucent hand. Its palm was turned towards Brid like an open book's page. Look for yourself, behold. And the dwarf, obeying not his own will but the might emanating from the being, beheld. The air in the cavern suddenly thickened, filled with a quivering, wavering mirage, and the polished, mirror-like wall swam as if blurred by pouring rain. Before his inner eye, with agonizing, painful clarity, unfolded a living chronicle of the recent past. He saw not the yellowed lines from old scrolls, but the mute yet furious anger on the familiar faces of his king forever leaving Almerion. Saw himself warily trudging along a dusty, lifeless road to the very foot of the dragon's back, to reclaim by force as stubbornness his dwarven cradle, sacred Khazad-dûl. He watched as the high elves raised an invisible yet palpable barrier, on the very border of the eternal forest, forever separating themselves from humans, their former allies. Saw how the dull axes of humans, driven by arrogance and blind pride, mercilessly felled the trees of the sacred white grove. With each new blow not only did age-old, living trees crash to the ground with a dull, underwater crack, audible only to his soul. A bloody fissure in the very fabric of existence widened ever further. He saw a cavern lying in the northern steppes, his gaze snatched from the gloom a ghostly figure at the grotto's center, from which an invisible force emanated in waves. The smoky spirit of an ancient orc flowed towards a living kinsman, and the latter froze in an agonizing spasm, beginning to merge with it into a monstrous unity. This was not absorption, but an intertwining, where ashen flesh wove into muscle and bone, filling them with age-old strength. The orc's body transformed, becoming more massive, eyes dimmed to fill with the steady crimson light of heated coals, in which remained nothing but impersonal might. After, his gaze, guided by an unknown, alien force, rushed into the very iron maw by the Black Hills, a place about which among his folk circulated the most vague and frightening rumors. He saw souls hundreds, thousands torn from bodily shells, with a silent scream, and drawn into a crystal pulsating, with a sickly crimson light, in the iron shaman's hand. The cold, soulless steel of his staff pierced even his own soul, and the desperate, soundless cries of the consumed echoed in his very heart, making it clench from alien, inexpressible pain. In one moment he was in that very cage and saw everything happening with his own eyes. How a young Miko, with his frightened gaze, was torn to bloody pieces by huge, greasy ogres. How some girl of about 15, with a face distorted by horror and fury, tried vainly, desperately to protect him, throwing herself at the monsters with bare hands. He heard her stifled, tearful whisper, her childish yet terrible in its helplessness oath sworn to herself in that last moment. Brid saw it all not just as a vision, he felt it with his skin, was aware of it with every particle of his being. And the taste of alien ash and alien despair stood on his lips, acrid and bitter. "Who are you?" he exhaled, forcefully tearing his gaze from the agonizing visions still dancing before his eyes, and still feeling in his mouth that very taste of ash and hopelessness. "I am one of the 12, the imperturbable answer sounded, each word like a heavy, smooth stone falling into the bottomless depths of an ancient well. "When the first of us, my brother, penetrated this world, the balance of existence, fragile as the first ice, was broken finally and irrevocably. The being slowly, with unearthly grace, rose to its feet, and in its smooth movement was the same unhurried, inexorable might with which majestic mountain ranges rise from the darkest bowels of the earth. Its lengthened shadow fell upon the polished, mirror-like walls, and for but a moment it seemed to Brid, rubbing his eyes, that before him loomed not a dwarf, but the very colossal mountain, having at last found voice and speech. "I am the ancient who remains faithful to the original order of this world." The being continued its narrative, and in its bottomless eyes distant, cold stars flared and died. "For your, albeit tenacious, mortal understanding, I am the guardian of this world order, much as you are the faithful protector of your folk in their underground halls. The one you saw in your visions, in the iron maw, is merely a physical shell, a vessel for true, incorporeal evil. One of my brothers, alas, has chosen the path of total and utter destruction." The air in the cavern suddenly thickened, became heavy as lead. The smell of ozone mingled with the thick aroma of ancient, untouched stone, as if a great tomb, sealed fast many millennia ago, had swung wide open. He is now gathering a vast army of beings whose souls are warped through and through with blind hatred for all that lives. That vile taint you saw in the iron maw is but the first, weakest sign of his global design. But against that dark power which has rejected its own purpose, I, alas, cannot stand alone. The balance is broken to its very foundations, and now for its restoration a firm, unyielding will, tempered in the crucible of countless battles, a will like yours, Brid's stone heart, is required. That is why I waited here, in this stone emptiness, precisely for you. So your brother, this ancient, took the form of an orc. The dwarf asked with contempt, his fingers again gripping the axe haft with familiar strength. In his hoarse voice was heard deepest disgust mixed with heavy, dwarven distrust. "We cannot, by our very nature, assume anyone's form. As one changes a cloak, the calm, even answer came. The ancient's voice sounded like the distant, multi-voiced echo in the depths of mountain caverns. "We can only enter, take up residence in one who is voluntarily, wholeheartedly ready to accept us, whose heart and soul are open to our influence." The being inclined its heavy head slightly, and in its eyes, for but a moment, all the age-old, unrelieved sorrow of a lonely guardian was reflected. "Little wonder that my errant brother ended up in an orc's body. Their souls are by nature black with hatred for all that lives, and their hearts are wide open to any darkness. Orcs themselves, by their own will, strive for pure destruction, and in this they became the most perfect, most capacious vessel for his fallen will." The air in the cavern grew still again, became motionless, and only the quiet, eternal hum of underground water somewhere below reminded of the unstoppable flow of time, which for these beings seemed not to exist. He gathers souls, but why? To what end? Brid asked again, more insistently, and in his voice was heard heavy, stony, innate to his race incredulity. All he heard from this being was like the raving of a mad skald, but those visions he had lived as his own memories did not allow him to simply dismiss these frightening words. Souls, Brid, the ancient answer, and its voice suddenly acquired a solemn, almost priestly intonation, sounding under the vaults of ancient temples, are not merely life, not just breath, they are the spark of being itself, the primordial, purest energy from which all existence was once woven. They are the very main, most solid foundation of all reality surrounding you. He made a small but significant pause so that his next words would acquire due weight. In the dwarf's consciousness, accustomed to thinking in categories of stone and steel, the one you saw, called the Iron Shaman, does not merely kill as your enemies in the Undercrofts do. No, he imprisons souls, these very sparks, in his crystal, accumulating power, drop by drop. And this accumulated, stolen power is needed for one single, monstrous purpose, to one day cast down from heavenly thrones the very creator gods themselves. He wishes to challenge their primordial authority over the world, using against the very creators their own creations, the very life essence of those they begot. But how can I help you? Brid asked, and in his habitually firm, stone-like voice sounded for the first time a timid, almost childlike indecision so uncharacteristic of this old, battle-hardened warrior. He looked at his own rough, scarred and calloused palms, accustomed over long years to feel only the confident weight of an axe haft. I am just a dwarf, flesh and blood. How can we, just the two of us, hope to stand against what has already come into our world then put down roots here? You must voluntarily let me into you, into your flesh and your spirit. The ancient uttered without a trace of emotion, and its simple, terrible words hung in the motionless air of the cavern like a final, irrevocable sentence. Otherwise I cannot leave this stone refuge and help your perishing world. I am trapped here until I find a suitable, willing vessel. Brid slowly, heavily shook his gray head, his long, tangled beard swaying with the motion like a living thing. And how many of you, such as you, have come here, to our world? He asked, trying with his practical, dwarven mind to grasp and understand the whole monstrous scale of the impending calamity. When the first, my errant brother, penetrated this world, I and one more of my brothers, striving to stop him, immediately hastened after him, the being answered, and its gaze suddenly became detached, as if peering into invisible threads of fate stretched through time and space. The one who took residence in the orc, you have already seen with your own eyes. I am here, before you, and where the third is now, I cannot yet say with certainty. He has not yet found a suitable shell, has not found a vessel. So, the one who took residence in the shaman can dispose of souls themselves, like a stone in his hand. The dwarf concluded slowly, pondering each word, and his mind, accustomed to the simple and clear logic of stone and steel, began building a frightening yet cohesive picture of events. And what is granted to you, the guardian? In what is your strength, your weapon? See for yourself, the ancient said simply and softly pointed a hand at the nearest wall, and then, before Brid's astonished eyes, from the opposite wall, right from the polished, seemingly dead stone, instantly, as if growing from the ground, sharp, razor-like stone spikes to dwarves high shot forth. They flashed in the cavern's dim, ghostly light, and it seemed the very matter of stone had suddenly come alive and bared its lethal fangs. A moment later the wall just as suddenly became perfectly smooth and even again, as if nothing had been, only a light rustle of dispersing dust violating the silence. Then the ancient smoothly raised its pale hand, and the massive stone upon which Brid sat tore from the floor without a single sound. The dwarf felt solid, familiar support vanish beneath him, and instinctively gripped the seat's rough edge with his strong fingers. He hovered in the air, while below gleamed the surface of polished stone, dully reflecting his own stunned, frightened face. A moment later the slab just as smoothly and soundlessly lowered back into place, emitting only a barely audible, final thud. So, you command rock and stone, Brid concluded, watching as the last, almost invisible traces of magic dissolved in the stifling air of the cavern. His voice sounded with new, acquired awareness, but in its depths still lurked a shadow of old, dwarven doubt. But tell me, what can we do, even combining our forces? against that darkness accumulating and growing in the iron maw, against the one who disposes of the very energy of souls as we do picks and hammers. The ancient slowly, with infinite weariness, inclined its heavy head. In its eyes, deep and bottomless as the oldest minds, surge immeasurable, age-old fatigue mixed with iron, unyielding resolve. There is very much you and I must yet accomplish. Its low voice sounded, and each word was heavy and weighty as a whole granite boulder, that there is almost no time left to prepare properly. The first thing we must do is gather our own loyal army, not of those possessed by blind hatred, but of those in whom still glimmers and lives the simple will to live. Delight. He fell silent, giving the dwarf time to comprehend all the heaviness of what was said. All else I cannot explain to you now with simple words. It is too complex for a mortal mind, but I can show you the whole path, when you agree to accept me into your heart and your flesh. Brid silently pondered all he had seen and heard, sorting each word like precious gems in his mind. The picture revealed to him was frightening and almost unbelievable, but even more terrible was the very thought of voluntarily letting this ancient, alien being into himself, into his body. Yet if all said was the utter truth, and the world truly stood on the brink of doom, then he, the old warrior, had nothing left to lose except his own solitary life. So, what must I do to accept you? He asked at last, and his voice again sounded with familiar firmness, though the fingers of his left hand involuntarily, from old habit, tightened on the cold axe haft. You need only agree, with all your heart, the being answered quietly. In its bottomless eyes a quiet but steady light flared and burned, like the distant reflection of stars on a black underground lake's surface. I agree, Brid Stoneheart uttered clearly and distinctly, without hesitation. In that same instant the very fabric of space around them shuddered, wavering like water in an underground lake from a stone's fall. Brid felt as if from all sides he were enveloped by invisible, warm currents of air emanating from the very living heart of stone. Then this enveloping warmth was replaced by a bone-piercing cold that penetrated deep inside, to the very vertebrae, the brain, making his teeth chatter. He felt each cell of his old, scarred body filling with a strange, pulsating energy ancient, inhumanly mighty, clearly not belonging to this world. Before his clouded vision swam dark and light circles. The cavern's even walls wavered as in a heat haze. He felt a light, intoxicating dizziness, then a growing, pressing pressure in his temples, as if invisible steel vices slowly, inexorably squeezed his skull. In his ears sounded a swelling, low-frequency hum, like the distant yet approaching roar of a great cavern. But soon in this hum began to emerge fragments of alien thoughts, fragments of memories clearly not his own, pictures of alien lives and worlds. Gradually, with the inevitability of water seeping into the finest, invisible cracks in rock, the vast consciousness of the ancient being began to fill his own mind. His personal thoughts, eternal cares for the clan, bright memory of past battles, the simple and clear wisdom of a dwarf began slowly to fade like lonely torchlights. In advancing hopeless twilight, he distinctly felt how his own will, once firm and unyielding as polished adamant, began to weaken and dissolve in this boundless, ancient stream of alien I. He could no longer say with certainty where his own memories ended and alien ones began. The warm, familiar image of his father's forge mingled with chaotic visions of primordial chaos from whose womb worlds themselves were born. The face of a friend fallen once beside him, in battle blur, and irrevocably vanished, yielding place to the majestic and indifferent visages of forgotten gods, and Colossi striding along milky ways. His own personality, all that made him Brid Stoneheart, retreated, was erased like a simple inscription on damp sand, slowly and surely washed away by the rising tide. He made a last, desperate attempt to grasp hold of himself, of the simple, rough Joe, from the familiar heaviness of an axe in his hand, of the native smell of heated metal and stone dust. But it was like trying to hold a mountain river in one's fist. The stream was too mighty, and the memory flooding him too immense and vast. And so there was no longer Brid, nor the ancient. In the dwarf's body, motionlessly standing in the cavern center, remained only a single, new, unfamiliar being. Its eyes, but a moment ago fiercely reflecting the last inner struggle, now looked upon the world with serene, all-understanding and therefore indifferent calm. It slowly raised a hand, clenched a fist with unfamiliar ease, and the polished stone of the cavern floor obediently, like soft clay, heaved, taking on a new, strange shape at its will. The way back was finally and irrevocably lost. the new being, in whose breast still beat the dwarf's heart but whose mind was now ruled by an ancient, cosmic will, slowly, unhurriedly turned towards the cavern's exit. It stepped forward onto the stone bridge unhurriedly, and each of its steps was firm, confident, and unerring, as if this narrow path had been trodden by it many times over long, bygone epochs. At the very entrance to the chasm, the dwarves still stood in their iron, unbreakable formation, repelling the furious, tide-like attacks of troglodytes, but now they felt with every fiber of their soul something, a sharp change in the very air, a shift in the pressure of the stone mass coming from above. And when they, turning, saw the familiar figure walking along the stone bridge, even old, unflappable Gronder, who had not taken his eyes off the enemy, halted for a moment, lowering his axe. It was their leader, Brid Stoneheart, but in his bearing, in his very gaze, something subtly different, alien had appeared, immeasurable confidence and calm, all-encompassing, might akin to the most ancient and great mountain. He descended to them, and his first order sounded not as a habitual command, but as a statement of an inescapable, for a known fact, uttered in the ancient language of stone and forgotten magic. We return to Nar-Uzdum-Arak. No explanations, no arguments. The dwarves, raised on iron discipline and blind faith in their leader, instantly, as one organism, moved into motion, shields close even tighter, covering the organized withdrawal. But the troglodytes, sensing the change, with new, blind fury intensified their onslaught, wave after wave surging against the steel wall. Then he, the former Brid, slowly turned towards the chasm wall. He uttered no incantation, made no gesture. He simply looked at it with his new, all-seeing gaze, and the stone came alive, obeying, with a deafening crash drowning out for a moment even the eternal roar of the waterfall. A huge part of the wall collapsed downward, burying under itself dozens of pale, hissing bodies and sealing the main passage from whence endless enemies issued. Dust rose in a thick column, and in the sudden, ringing silence only the measured, heavy dwarven step and the ragged whistle of their weary breathing were heard. Brid and his dwarves returned back along familiar, well-trodden tunnels, but this was not a retreat from an enemy lair. Each of their steps along the stone galleries, carved by generations of their ancestors, henceforth acquired a new, deepest, cosmic meaning. Their former mission that had led them here to reclaim Khazad-Kutol, to return the ancestors' ancient fortress, now seemed small and private, like carving a single runic sign against the background of the whole great saga of the world. Now they walked with different, terrible knowledge. They carried within themselves, or followed one who carried within himself, full understanding of a threat stretching far beyond their native underground halls. This was no longer a war for a single stronghold, not a dispute over or seams with goblins or troglodytes. This was a battle for the very soul of the world, for the very right of life to exist under sun and stars, under the mass of stone or in the green of forests. Their former goal, forged in anger and grievance, yielded to a duty whose weight no dwarf, even the wisest, could measure. They were returning to Nar-Uzdum-Arak not to lick wounds and tally losses, but to begin preparing for a war of a scale their folk had not known since the legendary, epic battles of the world's very founding era. And at their head walked no longer just a clan leader, but an incomprehensible being, in whose eyes burned the cold light of predestined fate, and in whose hands was concentrated a power capable of stirring the very foundations of mountains. Their path inward, into the very heart of darkness, had turned out to be merely a prologue, a preface to the main book. The true path, the path of salvation for all that is, was only beginning. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.